Hi, all. I'm Professor Tina Good, and I am going to talk to you today about the Ten Commandments. Now, we are not reading Exodus in this class, so we are not going to get the story of Moses, but it's really would not be appropriate to have a Bible class without talking about the Ten Commandments. But before we do, for those of you who do not know the story of Moses, let me just give you a quick primer or summary of that story. So in Genesis, we left off with the death of Joseph, and in Exodus, the next book after Genesis, we are now the Israelites are now in Egypt, and because of things that happen, leadership that takes over in Egypt, the Israelites are enslaved, or otherwise known as the Hebrews are enslaved, and they are enslaved for about 400 years with the promise that there would be somebody who would come and deliver them from their enslavement. That person, of course, is Moses, and there is a whole story of Moses, which how he comes to be in power within the Egyptian family that we will talk about a little bit more when we get to the Jesus story, because there are some parallels. But for now, just know that Moses is sent to deliver the Israelites from Egypt, but the Pharaoh refuses to allow them to leave. And this is when the 10 plagues happen that you may have heard of. And after each plague, the hope is that they will be able to leave. And then it says that God hardens the heart of Pharaoh until the very last plague, where all of the firstborn sons of the Egyptians are killed by a spirit of God, and they are allowed to leave. So imagine 400 years of the Israelites multiplying, and the amount of people that now would be involved in what we call the Exodus from Egypt. It would have been a tremendous amount of people that Moses would have had to shepherd, and so the Pharaoh lets them leave, and they get to in the story what is called the Red Sea, and then the Pharaoh's heart becomes hardened again, and he goes after them, and the Israelites start to complain and fear that Pharaoh's will kill them. Remember, they are now all leaving their home. It's been 400 years. They don't know Jacob. This is the only life that they've known. And they had food, they had, sort of customs, they had homes. It was where their ancestors were. It was where their children were born. And so now they're up against the Red Sea. They had no choice but to leave, because the Pharaoh actually banished them after the last plague. And now they're afraid of being killed. As a result, is the parting of the Red Sea, and the Israelites flee across. And while the Egyptians, depending on which doublet you're reading, the Egyptians come across and they are drowned when the Red Sea folds back in on them, thereby stopping the Egyptian military, from going after them. Okay, so now you have all of these people that are wandering in the wilderness without any type of centralized government, without any unifying thing to bring them together, such as land, such as a constitution, nothing that would really bind them together, except for that common history of what they had in Egypt and that enslavement, which is just not going to be enough. And what we see over and over again is that they run out of food and they complain, and then Moses calls on God and God saves them, and this keeps happening and happening and happening, right? And so Moses goes up on the hill, on the mount, and receives the 10 commandments. And it should not be thought that these are the only laws that are given, but they are the basis, if you will. They sort of parallel like what would be our constitution, those laws that now are going to centralize this massive amount of people around a singular document that is somehow going to bind them together. And what is what is that that's somehow supposed to bring them all together when they're not bound by land, when they're not bound by trade, when they're not bound by a centralized government? What is that going to be? So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you, and we're just going to take a quick look at the 10 Commandments, and we're going to examine them rhetorically, right? So this is not going to be, once again, a religious interpretation of the 10 Commandments. So please don't think that that is what that is, but this is a rhetorical analysis of the 10 Commandments, given the historical context, or at least the literary context that I have just provided for you. So in Exodus 20, it starts out with, and God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And so we see that God is opening up and saying, listen, I did this for you, right? And so you need to listen to what I'm saying because I did this for you. And it was, not an incidental thing. The number one, and if we think about it rhetorically, right? The first commandments are going to be the most important commandments, right? If we think about when you present something, just like the Bill of Rights, right? The first ones are the most important, right? And so the first one, you shall have no other gods before me, right? Done. No explanation, done. That's it. No other gods. Notice that there is not a suggestion that there are not other gods, but that you will worship this God, the Israelite God, the God of Jacob, the God of Abraham, Elohim, as it were. You will worship this God, right, above all other gods, right? So there you go. That's our centralizing theme that's supposed to bind this group together, right? We don't have a constitution. We don't have a centralized government. We don't even have a homeland, just the promise of a land, right? But they are now supposed to unify under this one God, okay? So how does one do that? So first of all, it starts out with what you shall not do, right? And you shall not make for yourself an idol. And notice this is not a one and done sentence, right? There is a lot of explanation there that is also accompanied with a threat should you decide that you do make an idol, right? And that threat is not only for you, right, but for your children and your children's children and your children's children for 4 generations, right? That this is such a severe, crime against God to create an idol that generations four down from you will be punished, right? But if you do follow this commandment, that you and your children and your children's children will benefit from God's love, right? And why would this be so important, do you think, in this culture? Well, listen, as we know from reading the Red Tent, and if you paid attention to Genesis, there were a lot of household gods, right, that could be created. And so it was really important not to have the households or the tribes factioning off, right, and celebrating these household gods, but household gods were a part of the system then, right? So it would have been very hard to get families to give up their household gods. So that's why we see that this threat is leveled, but it's so important to not have those if we're going to unify all of these people around this centralized God from which all of these other laws and government system will be created. Further, number 3 is you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. Now, this is today often interpreted like you shall not curse, right? But is that really what it meant? And we've talked about the importance of blessings and blessings and curses as genres, right? And that idea that a blessing and a curse has sort of magical power to it that can make it happen. And so this idea of using, the Lord's name in order to invoke some kind of magical happening was what they wanted to stop, right? That unless you were authorized to use the Lord's name for a blessing or a curse, then you should not do it. And in fact, Moses gets in trouble with this because later on, he invokes Lord's power and he hits a rock when the Israelites are once again complaining about that they don't have any water and they shall surely die. And Moses, out of anger, depending on which doublet you read, strikes the rock. And so, of course, as penance for the Israelites constantly complaining and Moses striking the rock, they're forced to wander for 40 years so that none of the people who left Egypt will see the promised land, okay? And Moses himself, even though he's done all these things, because he makes wrongful use of the name of the Lord, he is not allowed to enter the promised land. And then finally, instead of what you should not do, here's something that you should do, and that is remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Okay. And again, we see a lot of explanation there. What is the Sabbath day? And a lot of like why you should do this. Why should you not? And, it's like the Lord rested and whatnot. And so we see some, priestly influence coming in because of course, keeping that Sabbath day would fall to the priests, right? And that would ensure, their roles within this new founded, shall we say, government, or at least a structured societal system, okay, which is really placing priests, up towards the top. Okay, so notice out of the 10, the first 4 commandments, right? That's a lot. That's almost half of the commandments have to do with the worship of God. So, if we were looking at this from a nation building perspective, what we see is that these first 4 are really beginning to set up the unifying principles to keep these people together. We don't want to use the word nation because it's not quite an appropriate concept yet. We don't really have the concept of nation, but it's the closest thing that we have. I don't want you to think that, we have a centralized king or anything like that's way down the line, but this is the unifying force that's bringing all of these people with, all of the tribes together in some sort of centralizing way so that they will not factionalize. We'll see how well that works. Okay, and so then the 5th commandment is sort of what I call the transitional commandment. And that is, again, securing the hierarchy, right? There's God, right? And then there's the worship of God. So that would put, your sort of priests in there, right? And then honor your father and mother. Okay, and that would be literally honor your father and mother, right? We need to keep the families in order, right? We establish our hierarchy, right? The heads of the family, they should be honored, but also the heads of the tribes, right? Honor your father and mother, signify also, right? The leaders of your tribes, right? So, or honor them, obey them, respect them, and keep that hierarchy in place so that we can have social order among this group. And then the final 5, the final 5 commandments, I say, are those commandments that actually help keep order in the tribe. So your unifying principle, i.e. like our Constitution, right? And then here's the laws for maintaining order under that centralized system, which would have been under this single God, right? Not multiple gods like Egypt, because Egypt could get away with that. They had a centralized land, right? But they can't do this when they're in the wilderness. So we got to have these laws that keep people from, turning against each other. So the first one there is you shall not murder. And notice, it's very short. There's no explanation. It's much like the very first one, right? You shall not murder. Done, right? Why not murder? Because if you murder, then somebody else is going to murder, and then there'll be murdering happening, and social chaos will ensue, right? So you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. Now, we know what adultery means in the 21st century, but what would have adultery been in biblical times? And essentially, what would have been adultery in that time would have been a man sleeping with or having sex with a married woman. Okay, so that would have been considered adultery. And why would that have been such a big thing? Well, remember now, we're in a system of primogeniture where there's inheritance passed down through the family. And so there would have been a great deal of cultural anxiety because there was really no way to know, right, if your wife's child was actually your child, right? There was really no way to know that as a man. And so, they make this law, and it's quite a severe punishment if you're found to be in violation of it, especially for the married woman, but also for the man who would have been sleeping with the married woman. Guys, at this time, prostitution is really not an issue, as we see in Joshua later on, which we're not reading, but prostitution was really not a big deal. Sleeping with a married woman, because of the social chaos that it could cause, they had to have a law that was just right under "you shall not murder." Okay. And then "you shall not steal." Why? Because if you steal, then again, social chaos. Somebody's going to come back. There might be murder that comes as a result of it, right? And so property rights have to be maintained, right? It becomes very important, property rights. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. That's often interpreted as "thou shalt not lie." That's not really what it means in a truest sense. It's more of a legal code, so that if you're called to witness in a legal sort of situation where maybe somebody's been accused of murder, or they've been accused of adultery, or they've been accused of stealing, you have to tell the truth in that situation, right? That the laws and the judicial system that would have been in place in that time, just like today, right? We're supposed to rely on truth, and if that truth is not given, then the whole system begins to fall apart. So that's essentially what that means. And finally, again, going with we've got to keep property rights in place. You shall not desire or covet. Not only should you not steal, right, or commit adultery, but you shouldn't even want to, right? You should not covet or desire your neighbor's house, wife, slaves, oxes, or donkeys, right, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And of course, that makes sense, right? Again, keeping in that social order. But what I find particularly interesting about this last commandment is that house, wife, slave, ox, donkey, belongings, are all in the same sentence, right? That wife is really equal to donkey, right? It's like, don't want the belongings, the property, right, of your neighbor, which of course has to mean, by this point, if we haven't figured that out already, right, has to be the male leader of the household. Okay. And so these commandments were meant to unify the tribe and give them, sort of a basis, a foundation for all laws that are to follow. We are not reading the rest of the Torah, so we don't get the laws. But if we were to read Numbers and Leviticus, we would get a tremendous amount of laws. But these are the centralizing laws that are meant to unify this very divided and factionalized society. Now, as I said, we are not reading Joshua, but the trouble is when they finally do get to the promised land, Moses is not allowed to enter the promised land, as I said, but when they get there, they discover, oh my gosh, there are actually people there. And Joshua takes us through, sort of the Israelites' conquest of Canaan and the people that are there with God's help. But now we'll be getting into Judges. And what I want you to think about, first of all, is we're going to be looking at Deborah, a female judge, right? Which is fascinating to think about. But I don't want you to think of judge in quite the same way that we think of judge today, right? Yes, arbitrating, who stole whose lamb and whatnot would have been the role of the judge, but also the judge was seen as a military leader, sort of think of like Abraham, right? A military leader, sort of the head of the tribe, the one responsible for the government, the one responsible for keeping people in place, for adjudicating, and following God's order, right? So think of that when we think of judges. It's much more than the judge that we think of today who sits in a courtroom and adjudicates a legal proceeding, although that would have been also within the judge's purview. And so we are going to start out with Deborah, and we're going to end with Samson, both of whom are judges, but very, very different kinds of judges. And so if you watch the previous video on models, I want you to think about what kind of a model of a judge is Deborah, as opposed to what kind of a model of a judge is Samson, right? Who might be the good judge, who might be the bad judge, even though both are essentially selected by God, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily godly. Okay, so keep that in mind. When we're in Judges, what we have now, we still do not have a centralized government, but we have a centralized God with a very, very strong tribal system in place. Okay, again, we are not into the kings yet. We're going to be coming up to that later, but we do have a very, very strong tribal system that is based on, right, the sons of Jacob. I hope that you have found this video useful. Have a great day. And I can't wait to talk to you more when we get to Judges and the Kings.